Welcome, Adam's devoted followers, to this very short sermon dedicated to investigating a messy little mystery in Fallout 2. On the west coast of the United States, the Enclave weathered the Great War on an oil rig that was transformed and adapted to their genocidal needs, letting them launch vertibirds, do FEV experimentation, and research and develop new technologies. But where exactly is this oil platform? The answer is not as straightforward as it appears, but looking into it raises some questions and lets me talk a little geology, which always makes me happy. So crank up the rads and let's see what we can find with that offshore base of losers. The first step into any investigation is to consider all the evidence that we get in the games. Wouldn't you know it? Not only do we have some decent in-game lore, but we get some ultra-specific information. There is a military base used by the Enclave as one of, if not their main base, on the mainland United States in what is called Navarro, north of San Francisco, located near the real-world city of the same name. The Enclave have claimed a pre-war Poseidon oil refinery with an old US military base nearby, likely because it was a natural fit for the Enclave to coordinate their efforts and refuel their vertibirds as they come from or to the oil rig. The Chosen One is tasked to infiltrate the base to recover the schematics for the vertibird technology, which can be returned to one of three factions in San Francisco: the She, the Hubologists, or the Brotherhood of Steel, while trying to find the vertibird plans and being berated by Fallout's best drill sergeant.
You are out of uniform, soldier! Where is your power armor?
The Chosen One can interface with the Navarro central computer. The Chosen One can explicitly ask where the Enclave main base is located, and the computer will give a very specific answer. The computer states that the base is located 175 miles off the coast of California in the Pacific Ocean. Even better, we get coordinates: 37 degrees, 18 minutes north, and 120 degrees, 7 minutes west. The computer will even be snarky if the Chosen One says that they don't know exactly what that means, and will simplify the location details by saying that it's a long ways out in the ocean, it's west of San Francisco, and that if you do not understand the geographical coordinate system, then you won't find it. While the computer might be right with that last statement, does it really need to be such a jerk about it? You can also speak with a number of technicians at Navarro that give a generic answer when asked where the Enclave base is. They all say that the base is west of San Francisco, in the ocean, but never get more specific than that. So it seems pretty straightforward then. We have the coordinates. But if that's all it took, then we wouldn't have much of an investigation or a video. So let's plug these coordinates in and see what we get. Now, I may not be much of a geographer, but pretty sure that's not the Pacific Ocean. And are those cows? The computer was so busy being a douche that it didn't even check to make sure its coordinates were right. Well, it's obvious that the coordinates themselves are just plain old wrong, but what if just the longitude is wrong? If we reflect the coordinates on the horizontal plane, treating Navarro as the center of the reflection, this would land the oil rig right around here, and this could satisfy some of the evidence. This is west of San Francisco. It is a way out into the ocean, but over 200 miles from the coast, not 175 like the computer specifically said. We could keep the same latitude as the coordinates and go 175 miles off the coast, which would make the location about here, making it conform to the 175 miles it's said to be at. This is pretty good, and really there are not too many in-game issues with these locations as they are, and this second location at 175 miles off the coast is probably about as close as we can figure. It uses the same latitude from the coordinates, is 175 miles off the coast, it is west of San Francisco, and is in the deep sea. There is, however, an important consideration, and it's not so much with the in-game lore, but the real-life lore. To explain why these possibilities are a problem without getting too far off base, I want to talk about where oil and gas can actually be found. Oil and gas, or hydrocarbons, are created from organics that are subjected to plenty of heat and pressure. So a rock layer, formerly made up of sediment with plenty of organic material, is what is called the source, like this brown band. This is where our future oil will come from. On top of the source, you need a layer with plenty of interconnected space that will let the oil and gas flow. This is very often sandstone, shown by this tan layer. Finally, you need a top layer that doesn't allow any flow through it. It needs to be impermeable, and this is called the seal. The last ingredient that's needed is some sort of tectonic deformation or movement, because you need to create a trap, a place where all the hydrocarbons can collect. Like this, what we call an anticline. As the hydrocarbons form from heat and pressure in the source rock, they are much less dense than the water, which very often saturates these formations. And so it starts to rise towards the surface. It can travel through and saturate the sandstone because of all the holes. You can think of it like a big sponge, but it needs to get stuck at the seal and collect at these high points. Otherwise, the oil and gas will just escape all to the surface and be lost. Those high points are what most conventional oil extraction efforts target to slurp up all that oily, gassy goodness. All offshore oil operations target areas that have these basic elements, but do you know what doesn't have these critical features? The deep ocean. The sediment that accumulates in the open and deep ocean areas can vary, but are typically not rich in organics, which is needed as a source, do not have nice thick deposits of sand, which is needed for the reservoir, and are typically tectonically stable, so there are no real structures that can form traps. In short, there is what I would optimistically call an improbable chance of there being any oil or gas in these areas. So we are left to wonder, as we often do, is the Fallout world so different that these geologic details are moot? Much like how the fantastic engineering and the physics-defying technology of the series contradicts real-life science? That is certainly possible, but the oil rig lore only gets messier from here. In an easily overlooked location in Fallout 2, known as the Sierra Army Depot, there is a holodisk that is said to have transcriptions from everyone's favorite news source, Galaxy News Network. One news broadcast tells of how the US successfully claimed a deep-sea oil deposit, which was considered the world's last reserve of oil. China had tried to create their own oil platform to tap into this last remaining source, but experienced a number of setbacks that they claim was US sabotage, and they were unable to establish a rig at this last known reserve. Although there is no mention of this being the oil platform that is used by the Enclave, there are a few clues that it is. The platform mentioned in the broadcast is a deep-sea platform, meant to drill thousands of feet below the surface of the ocean to get to difficult deposits. And wouldn't you know it, the oil rig being 175 miles off the shore in this area would definitely be considered a deep-sea rig. This broadcast makes it clear that this oil resource has not been tapped precisely because it is so deep. So deep-sea rigs were not common and were seen only as a last resort, which further increases the odds that the rig mentioned in the broadcast is the Enclave base. The Enclave would also benefit greatly from being able to monopolize the last deposit of oil and continue exploiting it even in the post-war, generating needed energy or fueling the vertibirds, as opposed to being established on just some old dusty platform that can no longer pump any oil since it's all been used up already. Now, these news broadcasts have largely been retconned by later games when Fallout 3 changed the date of the Canadian annexation, the date of the invasion of Alaska, and mentioning the existence of the UN, which Fallout 3 mentions as being disbanded in the 2050s. However, long before Bethesda acquired the Fallout IP, many details from these broadcasts were causing discrepancies with the established lore. So many details from these broadcasts were already causing discrepancies with the established lore that Chris Avallone himself, in the 7th edition of the Fallout Bible, talked about how the Sierra Army Depot holotape was one of the more problematic parts of Fallout 2, and he wanted to drop it from continuity. So before Bethesda decided to retcon most of this holotape, developers like Chris were already wanting to, making what little details we know of the Enclave platform, if the platform mentioned in the news is indeed referring to the Enclaves, just that much more confusing. So the coordinates given in the game are wrong, and a holotape with some details that heavily imply that they're talking about the Enclave base are so incongruent with the rest of the lore that it was just easier to retcon the details out, much of which Bethesda has already done. Now there is one other small line that talks about the Enclave's vertibirds that came down from either Navarro or Arroyo, because they were transporting the Arroyo villagers that were taken captive by the Enclave. They were taken to the oil rig, where they could be experimented on as part of the Enclave's pursuit to create the perfect bioweapon to wipe out all those that developed post-war mutations. Given that the world was drenched in Adam's glow, this means they're gonna kill basically everyone. Lao Cho is the shopkeeper of the Flying Dragon 8 shop in San Francisco, and while he obviously deals in goods and wares, he also deals in information. The Chosen One can converse with Lao Cho and broach the topic of vertibirds, specifically some that were carrying his fellow villagers. They will say that they heard some flying machines brought a load of villagers, quote, down this way, presumably meaning San Francisco. Lao will respond by saying that they weren't brought to San Francisco, but that he saw the vertibirds come from the north, fly over the city, and head out over the sea. That is a very unusual path to take from Navarro or Arroyo, which lie to the north, to the oil rig if it is indeed out west. Why fly over San Francisco and then hook west towards the sea rather than just flying straight to the rig in the shortest path possible? Again, we are left in a situation where a lot of this information just doesn't really add up. So it's pretty clear now that the lore surrounding some of the background and details of the oil rig are messy, confusing, or just plain wrong. And even our most generous interpretations of where the oil rig could actually be make no sense from a geologic point of view. But it doesn't have to be that way, because there is an area that could be geologically viable, still require the oil rig to operate in extremely deep waters, can be around 175 miles off the Californian coast, and could explain why Lao Cho saw vertibirds flying over San Francisco. Pretty far south of San Francisco, in the waters just off of Santa Barbara, LA, San Diego, and Baja California, is a complex and interesting area that for a long time has been used for oil extraction. Known as the California Continental Borderland, it is a complicated system of basins and ridges that experienced a lot of deformation at a time when the Pacific tectonic plate and the North American plate started to smash together. The short and sweet of it is that it results in the exact kind of geologic environment I spoke of earlier when describing how oil and gas is created and trapped. The area is also really big. It extends off the coast of California as far as 190 miles. So that's within the 175-mile range that the Navarro computer mentions. The shallow areas closest to the shore have been exploited for oil since the early 20th century, with early accounts mentioning a noticeable petroleum smell and even small bubbles of oil that could be seen floating on the ocean surface. To this day, the shallow portion continues to be exploited by a number of oil rigs. The deeper basins, farther from the coast, can be as deep as 2,000 meters or 6,000 feet, which is definitely deep enough to consider it deep-sea drilling, just like the Enclave oil rig. Here is the 175-mile line, and I found an illustration of the area with all the basins, which I georeferenced in QGIS. You can see that the line doesn't intersect with any large basins, but if we are willing to fudge the numbers just a little bit, around 20 miles on average, there are 3 separate known basins that could be potential locations for a deep-sea rig. The report from Lao Cho about vertibirds flying over San Francisco could also make sense if we consider the direct flight paths from Navarro or Arroyo to this region. The vertibirds would need to fly right over the city or pretty close to it and fly parallel to the coast. Now, there are a number of issues when considering this area as the location for the oil rig that would need to be worked out to be congruent with some of the things we know. The main point that would directly contradict the possibility of the oil rig being in this area comes from the central computer and the personnel at Navarro. They are all in agreement that the base lies west of San Francisco, which this region just isn't. The central computer is obviously wrong about the accuracy of the coordinates, and that would lead me to dismiss the other claims about the location of the base, But there is one detail that is confirmed by all the technicians. Everyone is very sure that the base is west of San Francisco, although they never go into more detail than that. None of the other claims about where the Enclave base is would be directly contradicted by an oil rig in this area, except for the statement that it is west of San Francisco. That said, there would be some other questions if we were to seriously consider this area as the actual location of the base. If the oil rig was located in this region, why would the Enclave travel so far north to establish a base on the mainland? Why would they effectively travel the length of California to abduct a bunch of random villagers, as opposed to traveling south into Mexico, or just east into the mainland? Well, one possible explanation for this is that at this point in time in Fallout 2, Southern California is dominated and controlled by the NCR. Indeed, the NCR is on the doorstep of Central California and Nevada, as can be seen in Fallout 2, as they have not yet annexed the large settlements of Vault City, San Francisco, or New Reno. I think a logical explanation for the Enclave to travel so far north to establish a base, conduct missions, gather supplies, and kidnap test subjects would be because they would avoid interacting with or alerting the NCR to their presence. Flying vertibirds into NCR territory, claiming, manning, and fortifying a base, just like with Navarro, would not be tolerated by the NCR, who would see such a move as a major threat. They are one of the few groups in the Wasteland that could muster the manpower to threaten the Enclave's ambitions. Up north, they would be largely out of sight for the NCR, able to use the non-unified factions of this area of the Wasteland to do as they pleased, and could do so essentially unopposed. Traveling north over the ocean would also keep the vertibirds from being seen by people on the coast, thereby alerting the NCR. The distance between the Navarro base and the region I have proposed for the oil rig is also not unreasonably far, between 500 and 600 miles, depending on where you put the oil rig. A modern V-22 Osprey, which operates very similar to the Fallout vertibirds, has an operating range of over 1,000 miles, so this is within a completely realistic flight range. Navarro would also be a pretty reasonable distance to perform refueling for any missions that would go even farther away or for return flights. Now, after saying all of this and justifying it to work with the lore, I think it is important to clarify that this area in the south is not where the oil rig was meant to be. The way the oil rig is talked about by the personnel at Navarro, it is said multiple times to be off the coast of San Francisco, a long ways off and only accessible via vertibirds or large seafaring ships like the tanker. However, I hope that it's also clear that whether intentional or not, the game itself doesn't seem to know where the rig is or its own history. Many of the in-game clues that hint towards its location and background are either wrong or not entirely consistent with one another, implying that there was no intent behind establishing an actual location other than it's pretty far away, in the ocean, west of San Francisco somewhere. Taking into account the details of the rig, Lao Cho's statements of vertibirds flying over the city, and combining that with some real-world geology, I think the borderland area would make the most sense. I think some of the questions that would arise related to why the Enclave would operate so far from the base could also be adequately explained. If I were to pick an actual honest-to-atom location, I would narrow it down to 3 different offshore basins: the San Miguel Basin, the Patton Basin, or the Santa Cruz Basin. All have hydrocarbon potential, are at least 150 miles off the coast of California, and are deep enough that the only reason you would consider drilling here is if you are really desperate. All of these locations would be within a realistic range for the vertibirds that are regularly flying up to Navarro as well. I know it doesn't really count for much, but I like to pretend that this is where the final showdown with Frankentank goes down, and if you want to too, well, the more the merrier. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts. Do you agree that the location just off of San Francisco is the closest to the intended location of the base? Do you think it's actually somewhere else entirely? What in Adam's name is going on with those coordinates with the central computer? Is that a mistake on the part of the devs? Or is the Navarro computer wrong, either intentionally or not? Would you be interested in videos that focus solely on the messiest parts of Fallout lore? I hope this is obvious by now, but I love Fallout. I love looking at some of the quirks of the series and trying to find an explanation or pattern. And when I realized just how wrong these coordinates were, I knew I wanted to look at it a little closer and really dig into the details to see what I could find. Thank you to my patrons on screen now, and I hope you can forgive me for the uncharacteristically short video this week. I will be taking 2 weeks before my next upload, as I'll be traveling and taking some time with my family. Adam bless you all. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you soon.